I'm here today with a really special book. It's a copy of the 1640 edition of Shakespeare's poems.
We have a first edition of The Great Gatsby.
Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen.
Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, that it hasn't been touched or restored in over 150 years.
Il était une fois un petit prince qui habitait une planète à peine plus grande que lui et qui avait besoin d'un ami.
So, now I'd like to read from it. Hi. We're here to talk about The Great Gatsby. If you went to high school in the United States, you probably read it then. But if you haven't read it recently, you've never read it, you're in for a treat. It was actually published 100 years ago this year in 1925. There's a lot to talk about with this book, from the themes of class, the American dream, what happens when that dream goes sour, what happens to someone who seems to have it all then loses it all. It's also the story of Scott Fitzgerald not really knowing what he wanted to call the book as he got through it. At one point he was going to call it Among the Ash Heaps and Millionaires, which is a terrible title, and we would probably not be reading it today if it wasn't The Great Gatsby, but maybe so, because the book itself is such a wonderful story, and I would like to read from it now. So there are many iconic lines in The Great Gatsby, but in this case, rather than reading the first lines about how different you might be perceived if you come from a place of wealth, I want to go to the aftermath. Gatsby's house was still empty when I left. The grass on his lawn had grown as long as mine. One of the taxi drivers in the village never took a fare past the entrance gate without stopping for a minute and pointing inside. Perhaps it was he who drove Daisy and Gatsby over to East Egg the night of the accident, and perhaps he'd made a story about it all his own. I didn't want to hear it. I avoided him when I got off the train. I spent my Saturday nights in New York because of those gleaming, dazzling parties of his were with me so vividly that I could still hear the music and the laughter, faint and incessant, from his garden and the cars going up and down his drive. One night I did hear a material car there and saw its light stop at the front steps, but I didn't investigate. Probably with some final guest who'd been away at the ends of the earth and didn't know the party was over. On the last night, with my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at that huge, incoherent failure of a house once more. On the white steps, an obscene word scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick stood out clearly in the moonlight, and I erased it, drawing my shoe raspingly over the stone. Then I wandered down to the beach and sprawled out on the sand. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except for the shadowy moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. As the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island that had flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green beast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in its history with something commiserate to his capacity for wonder. As I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He'd come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere in the back, in that vast obscurity behind the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgiastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther. And one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
This is a first edition of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, one of the most important scientific treatises ever to be penned. What's extraordinary about this copy is that it's what we call an unsophisticated copy, meaning that it hasn't been touched or restored in over 150 years. As you can see, it's bound in the original publisher's cloth, which is beautifully embossed. The gilding on the spine is still quite bright. Often, whether it's by the sun or handling, the gilt letters are the first to fade. You can see here that there's some wear to the top of the spine, where you can imagine somebody having pulled it off of a shelf. You can see some small marks to the corners where, again, you can imagine it resting near its friends, where it would have slid along in good company, next to Charles Lyell or Alfred Russel Wallace. Now I'll read a passage from Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Given his great voyage, it seems as though the best place to begin is at the beginning. Introduction. When on board HMS Beagle as naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the inhabitants of South America and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts seem to me to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers. On my return home, it occurred to me in 1837 that something might perhaps be made on this question by patiently accumulating and reflecting on all sorts of facts which could possibly have any bearing on it. After 5 years' work, I allowed myself to speculate on the subject and draw up some short notes. These I enlarged in 1844 into a sketch of the conclusions which then seemed to me probable. From that period to the present day, I have steadily pursued the same object. I hope that I may be excused for entering on these personal details, as I give them to show that I have not been hasty in coming to a decision. My work is now nearly finished, but as it will take me 2 or 3 more years to complete it, and as my health is far from strong, I have been urged to publish this abstract. I have more especially been induced to this as Mr. Wallace, who is now studying the natural history of the Malay archipelago, has arrived at almost exactly the same general conclusion that I have on the origin of species.
So here we have a first edition of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, published in 1813 in an edition of 1,500 copies. The brown calf binding with gilt edges and tooled gilt turn-ins. The end papers are marbled. It was published anonymously. On the title page it simply says, by the author of Sense and Sensibility. It was not a commercial success during her lifetime. Little did she know it would inspire countless adaptations and become one of the most loved novels in the English language. One of my favourite passages from the book is the opening line. Chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighbourhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." That was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately, that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of the week." "What is his name?" "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls."
It's a copy of the 1640 edition of Shakespeare's poems, the sonnets. It's the second edition, but the first that you will ever see outside an institutional library. You can see it still in its original 17th century binding. It's quite simple, but with some gilding here and a nice little centerpiece there. It looks very much as it will have done in the 17th century. And this contrasts to most copies of the book, which will have been rebound often in the 18th or the 19th century, frequently in a much more lavish and beautiful binding, but not one that connects us so firmly to the period of the book's publication. I'm not wearing gloves today because I'm going to be opening the book and turning the pages, and I really need the sensitivity in my fingers, which I can assure you are clean, which is the important thing. Now, what we have here is a really fascinating piece of publishing history. It's an early example of the way that each generation reshapes Shakespeare. When John Benson came to publish this book in 1640, at a time, in fact, when England was about to descend into civil war, he was publishing poems that were written nearly 50 years earlier, and Shakespeare had been writing in the traditional 14-line sonnet form, which by Benson's time was decidedly old-fashioned. It was not how poets of the 1630s and 40s were writing. So what he did to try and make sure that these poems seemed relevant to readers is he rearranged the order of the sonnets. He merges some of the sonnets together to form longer poems, and he gives them all titles, which Shakespeare had not done. He also, in his titles, rather hides the fact that most of the sonnets were written to a young man, and in a couple of cases, he even changes the pronoun to feminize the love object. These changes have not endeared Benson to later critics, and the book has been criticized quite harshly. But I don't think we should be too hard on him. I mean, in 1640, Shakespeare was not the great canonical poet that he is today. And what Benson was doing was, of course, he was trying to sell his book, but he was trying to introduce a new generation of readers to Shakespeare's poems, to some of the most beautiful lyric poetry ever written in the English language. And that's something that I guess we should be grateful to. And let's end with an example. Like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. Each changing place with that which goes before, in sequent toil all forwards do contend. Nativity, once in the main of light, crawls to maturity, wherewith, being crowned, crooked eclipses gainst his glory fight, and time that gave doth now his gift confound. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth, and delves the parallels in beauty's brow, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. And yet, to times in hope, my verse shall stand, praising thy worth, despite his cruel hand.
Qui ne connaît pas le Petit Prince, ce héros de l'œuvre la plus traduite au monde? C'est à travers 15 dessins que nous allons redécouvrir ce petit garçon. Ces dessins ont été exécutés par Saint-Exupéry au cours d'un déjeuner chez Jean Amrouche et Suzanne Amrouche. Jean Amrouche était un journaliste et écrivain qui habitait à Alger à ce moment-là. Et c'est au cours de ce déjeuner que Saint-Exupéry exécute sur la nappe en papier quelques petits dessins. Et Suzanne Amrouche lui tend son carnet de notes afin qu'il cesse d'écrire sur la table et qu'il écrive sur ce petit carnet. On retrouve aussi le Petit Prince traînant en laisse un escargot. L'escargot qui est un animal qu'on ne retrouve pas dans le livre de Saint-Exupéry. Encore une fois, sur sa planète, là, tel qu'on le retrouve sur la couverture du livre, le livre est paru peu de temps avant l'exécution de ces dessins. Puisque ces dessins, exécutés donc à la fin de l'année 43, début 44, le Petit Prince paraît à New York en avril 1943. Et maintenant, j'aimerais vous lire un passage du Petit Prince. Le Petit Prince s'en fut revoir les roses. Vous n'êtes pas du tout semblable à ma rose, vous n'êtes rien encore, leur dit-il. Personne ne vous a apprivoisé et vous ne m'avez apprivoisé personne. Vous êtes comme était mon renard. Ce n'était qu'un renard semblable à 100 000 autres, mais j'en ai fait mon ami. Et il est maintenant unique au monde. Et les roses étaient bien gênées. Vous êtes belle, mais vous êtes vide, leur dit-il encore. On ne peut pas mourir pour vous. Bien sûr, ma rose à moi, un passant ordinaire croirait qu'elle vous ressemble, mais à elle seule, elle est plus importante que vous toutes, puisque c'est elle que j'ai arrosée, puisque c'est elle que j'ai mise sous mon globe, puisque c'est elle que j'ai abritée par le paravent, puisque c'est elle dont j'ai tué les chenilles, sauf les 2 ou 3 pour les papillons, puisque c'est elle que j'ai écouté se plaindre ou se vanter, ou même quelquefois se taire, puisque c'est ma rose, et il revient vers le renard. Adieu, dit-il. Adieu, dit le renard, voici mon secret. Il est très simple. On ne voit bien qu'avec le cœur. L'essentiel est invisible pour les yeux.